A Web Too High, or Toodles and the Bored Stiff Coffee Drinkers by M. David Fairchild. It began, of all places, at a Thursday morning meeting of the Bored Stiff Coffee Drinkers at the Wide-Eyed Bean Coffee House on 32nd Street and 31st Avenue. It was, admittedly, an audacious plan, one which would require tenacity, financing, and lots of chutzpah. The idea was to march en masse into the Skylian National Archives, right there in Skylia, and demand at Quill Point to see the original parchment of the founding principles of the Skylian state. Said document amounted to the essence of the overthrow of the preceding dynasty by the founders of the Skylian dynasty. Very few people knew that the founding principles of the Skylian state consisted of one single sentence. "I'm out here with a gun, so get lost or die!" So far as anyone could tell, no living person had ever so much as seen the parchment on which it was written. It was, as the Royal Skylia archivist frequently explained, too acute for commoners to understand, and anyway, it was infused with magic that would instantly melt the skin off anyone who viewed it. It was, therefore, best to view the library's 5-volume annotated copy with all of its footnotes, commentary, diagrams, charts, and graphs. The enabling point on which the plan was based was that the potod, the blank check on which the national treasury and consequently the Skylian economy was based, lay on display and unprotected at the same National Archives. This made it simple to snatch up the potod by hand and demand that the founding principles of the Skylian state be laid before them in exchange for the potod, after they had read the document, of course. This plan would only work if they bore a sharpened, loaded quill and were willing to use it. Of course, the Bored Stiff Coffee Drinkers were primarily known for their audacity, not for their intelligence. They read quite well, but could not write. Well, they could at least write their names. Hence, the current standoff, in which 5 people, a loaded quill, and the blank check called potod were pitted against a small, highly trained military force armed with daggers, swords, bows and arrows, black widow spiders, poison-toed centipedes, catapults, and acid-coated lassos. Demands had been made, threats asserted, acquiescence feigned, counter-threats made, cooler heads brought in, but still the standoff prevailed. It was a warm day, warm enough that many people were out and about. One of them, Lakita, was simply passing by the admittedly humorous scene when a quote-unquote brilliant member of the military intelligence thought of a way to break the impasse. He snatched her from the street and marched her to the front line, where he held his personal secretary's loaded quill to her head. Toodles, the chief intelligent military member, then announced his intention.
"Hand over the potod or the bystander gets it."
Gets what?
Responded Goder, a 70-year-old bored stiff coffee drinker who was no match for the muscle-bound Officer Toodles. But the military officer who faced them from behind the shoulder of a frightened young woman was not very fearsome, at least not to the coffee drinkers. Still, they were generally curious as to what Toodles had in mind. The audacious response caught Toodles off guard, so he stammered for a bit, shrinking 3 inches in the process.
"Well, we'll ink. We will ink her.
How?
With a quill, of course."
What do you mean? Will you let her see the ink in order to scare her into a heart seizure?
Toodles was embarrassed that he had not thought of such an audacious use of the quill, but he quickly recovered his dignity and his lost 3 inches of height by declaring,
Yeah, she'll see the ink.
instantly, every bored-stiff coffee drinker knew just how literate Officer Toodles really was, given that he seemed to believe that the sight of ink would cause instant death.
And what if it doesn't kill her?
Well, of course we will write on her
Right what?
a word.
What word?
Which word had not occurred to Toodles? After all, a word is a word is a word, is it not? He stalled for time.
Just a minute, please.
He turned to his assistant and hissed,
Get one of those word thingies, one of those word guides, a field guide to words or whatever it's called.
His assistant paused for a moment, staring at him blankly.
A dictionary?
Yeah, that's it. Go get one.
Then, turning to the horrid hostage takers, he casually called out,
It'll be just a minute. We have to find the worst possible word, one that will make her suffer until you release the potsherd unharmed.
Goder sighed and replied with a suppressed bemusement,
Oh yes, please do take your time. Such things must not be rushed.
Much subdued snickering ensued among the coffee drinkers. Toodles saw it, but assumed that it was the snickering of fear that he had learned about in boot camp. Many enemies, apparently, died with their faces contorted in laughter due to fear. Poor Lakita was baffled and scared beyond words.
What in God's name is happening to me?
She thought,
What are they going to write on me? What could be so terrible, so horrible, that they need to consult a dictionary to decide my fate?
Meanwhile, Private Larkson was wandering from door to door in the background, asking local residents and shopkeepers if they had a dictionary. Inevitably, he was met with confused shrugs and said,
Sorry.
In time, he returned to Officer Toodles, with whom he spoke in low tones. Officer Toodles turned, with much eye-rolling, and pointed to some other lackey-looking cohorts, shaking his finger vehemently. Private Larkson scurried off to round up the indicated cohorts. Officer Toodles turned to the bored-stiff coffee drinkers and smiled his infamous, studied, pernicious smile. Private Larkson and cohorts formed a huddle, and after much agitated discussion, mostly on Private Larkson's part, they hurried off to interrogate even more locals, most of whom answered hidden from behind hesitant, shivering doors. Most of them had dictionaries, but no one who could see the scene wanted to turn them over to an angry and ignorant sergeant who was waving an overloaded quill. So they lied. The bored-stiff coffee drinkers watched the scene unfolding before them with increasing incredulity. Their general demeanor slowly evolved from sad bemusement to genuine concern as they witnessed the residents of the area subjected to such astounding and aggressive idiocy. After about 20 minutes of this, Officer Toodles called someone on his special policing communications device, and after much muffled muttering slammed the SPCD, Spicy D was the verbal shortism, into its holster. He had so many holster devices that his shoulders and pants sagged. The bored-stiff coffee drinkers no longer snickered. Someone with some intelligence might get involved. That would be disastrous. Or, well, maybe someone less blindly intent on his goal might deal with the situation more in their favor. Officer Toodles stood thinking in silence, momentarily with his back to the bored-stiff coffee drinkers. Then he turned, still still holding poor Lakita in a necklock. Lakita, who was obviously uncomfortable in this necklock, had ceased to look scared and now looked merely bored. Tightening his grip on his hostage, he turned to the horrid hostage takers and shouted,
All right, we cannot find a field diction, but it doesn't matter. I'll just write rot.
rot, being the biggest, baddest word that he knew he could spell without embarrassing himself. Now it was their turn to huddle, which they did for some time. Twice, Officer Toodles tried to interrupt the board-stiff coffee drinkers. The first time, the leader by default held an index finger in the air to indicate that they needed a minute. 5 minutes later, Officer Toodles tried to interrupt them again, this time using a rolled-up newspaper to magnify his voice. One horrid hostage taker responded by holding up the potard, while another held up a quill. This tactic brought them another 5 minutes in huddle. The last time Officer Toodles interrupted them, he did so to inform them that they had obtained a dictionary. Again, potard and quill hovered momentarily over the huddled mass of Thursday morning coffee drinkers. The discussion in this extended criminal huddle of horror, as Toodles termed it, went something like this.
This guy is nuts.
Well, that's all well and fine for him, but he is terrifying that young lady.
And the neighborhood looking for that dictionary.
But he's found a dictionary now, so he can just focus on us.
We have to do something. He's going to scare half the population with his threats. How ridiculous they are.
Okay, but what can we do about it?
Such discussion went on for some time, with said interruptions, before they settled on a plan. They de-huddled long enough to make their demands, or beg, as Officer Toodles thought of it. Their demands were for 1, an hour, so that they could think the matter over. 2, coffee for each of them, black, but with sugar, vanilla flavoring, and cream on the side, because it helped them think rationally. And 3, the hour was to begin when they got the coffee. Officer Toodles reluctantly acquiesced, saying,
An hour after the coffee comes, and that is all. We will coddle potard threatening terrorists only so much and no more.
The board-stiff coffee drinkers thanked him.
Thanks, Toodles. You are so sweet, Officer Toodles.
We don't deserve such a nice, sweet police in Skylia.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And so on and so forth. Officer Toodles blushed. The board-stiff coffee drinkers then sat down in a tight circle and waited for their coffee. One pulled out a book to read. Another leaned against the building they were next to and closed her eyes. Another pulled out a phone and called someone. 2 others put a piece of paper on the ground and played a number of pencil games, mostly tic-tac-toe. Officer Toodles was flummoxed. Why were they not concocting their despicable, devious plan? The explanation he finally decided on was that they needed the time to enjoy their last few minutes of freedom. Time passed. The crowd of onlookers grew. At a comfortable distance from the police and Officer Toodles' bystander hostage, they were quite peaceful. In fact, the entire scene took on a feeling of an old, now obsolete, pleasant Sunday afternoon at the bandshell. Eventually, though, the crowd had begun to murmur. The bored-stiff coffee drinkers displayed no particular reaction to the murmuring. Officer Toodles glanced briefly and saw that they were reacting to an old airplane in the sky. A curiosity, but little more. He kept his keen eye soundly fixed on the horrid hostage takers. It was not very long, however, before one of his subordinates came up and whispered in his ear. He turned and saw that the airplane was riding in the sky. It had thus far written O, F, F, I. So he said to the other officer,
Don't bother me with that. Let them gawk. I have a hostage situation here.
and he returned his eagle eye to the bored-stiff coffee drinkers, who were still being actively bored. Then, yet once again, the subordinate interrupted him.
What?
He yelled, staying focused on the gang with the quill. He was devising new names for them as he waited.
You really need to see this.
Exasperated, Officer Toodles turned around and looked up. There in the sky was written, O, F, F, I, C, E, R, T, O, O, D, L, E, S. This shook Officer Toodles a bit. He turned to glare at the coffee-drinking hostage threateners on the sidewalk, but they were now looking at the sky too, obviously as amazed as everyone else. He turned again to see why his name was spelled out in the sky. As he watched the airplane slowly continue to spell out G, O, O, D, B, Y. He turned, and, obviously, they were gone. The potod sitting beneath an empty coffee cup, unharmed except, it later turned out, for a very tiny coffee stain on one corner of the check. The airplane finished E. Officer Toodles looked again. They were still gone. The potod was still there. The only hostage in sight still had Officer Toodles' arm wrapped around her neck. He shouted,
Find them!
Officers swarmed the streets, but they could not tell hostage takers from bystanders. Eventually they gave up. They had to. After 4 hours of stopping everyone in sight, there was no one left in sight. Finally, Officer Toodles released Lakita from his arm lock, dashing the loaded quill to the ground.
Can I go?
She asked. Officer Toodles only growled and walked dejectedly away. His official report had his troopers handling crowd control, while he dodged stirring sticks hurled from tiny, custom-made crossbows. According to his version of things, a unanimous passerby heroically leapt in and shielded him until his plan of skywriting Officer Toodles goodbye convinced the hostage takers that he was quite insane, and they fled in terror, inevitably dropping the potod in the process of fleeing. It was nearly 2 months before Officer Toodles was awarded the highest award the Skylian royalty could offer, the Quadruple Star, now redesigned with crossed coffee stirring sticks, for heroically saving the Skylian economy. Toodles, however, was constantly harassed by the bored-stiff coffee drinkers, whose names he never knew, not even the name of the group. Every Thursday, an anonymous cup of coffee would appear on his desk. At first he was outraged. He tried to catch them in the act of purchasing the coffee, but it was always home brewed and in a cup for some random coffee house. Eventually he took to viewing it as an unavoidable irritant, like a spider in a web too high to reach. He ignored them. He never forgot just how useless that field guide to words had been in his hour of need.
Imagine a field guide to words that has to be read to be useful. Nary a picture in the thing.
He thought. Never again would he take an assignment that involved field guides to words, ink, or quills, or even pencils for that matter. His superiors displayed compassion for him and always assigned such cases to other officers. Eventually, he did become a coffee drinker. He even learned to use a dictionary, although he would never admit to any of it.